Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to our book club episode for June. This month, we've invited you to join us in reading a book from this year's Women's Prize for Fiction longlist, Somewhere Else by Jenni Daiches. Miriam Margolyes said of the book, Jenni Daiches has astonishingly recreated a lost world, the story of so many who came from somewhere else and tried to make a life. I wept and laughed and wished I'd written it. Miriam uses that word astonishing, and I think that's the perfect way to describe what an incredible achievement this book is in its scale and scope, exploring two world wars, the creation of Israel, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, in an epic generational tale of displacement, identity, love, and hope. Somewhere Else is out now and published by Scotland Street Press, and if you haven't already read it, you can grab yourself a copy via the link in the show notes. Jenni Daiches is an author that has also been published as Jenni Calder. She was born in the US and has lived in Scotland since 1971. Jenni is the author of 3 previous novels and 2 collections of poetry, including Mediterranean, published by Scottish Cultural Press, and Smoke, published by Catalonia. As Jenni Calder, she has published works of biography, literary and social history. Jenni is a previous president and current trustee of Scottish Pen. Her novel Somewhere Else was published at the end of last year and, as mentioned before, was longlisted for this year's Women's Prize for Fiction. And here to chat all about it, welcome Jenni to A Pair of Bookends.
Well, it's very good to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you. I've been so excited to have this chat with you because I feel like this book has been my life for the last week. I've been so immersed in this wonderful world that you've created and all these fantastic characters, and it has been such a joy. So thank you so much. Sorry,
It's
go on.
fantastic that you found it such a positive read.
Oh, it's very, very sad. It's very sad in places, and you broke my heart in many places. But I think, there are so many moments of love and family and hope, and it's just incredible what you've done with this book. But before we get into your book, I always like to ask authors what they are reading at the moment. So could you tell us?
Well, I've been reading my way through the long list.
Oh, amazing.
Which is a lovely experience because it's a very diverse list.
It is.
But I have to say that my particular favorite is one of my most favorite authors, is Elizabeth Strout. That's where I am at the moment.
Would you say that Elizabeth Strout is one of the authors that has maybe inspired you on your writing journey?
Well, yes, in a way, because she's an example of what can be achieved. I don't think my writing is like hers, but I just love her books, and I admire the very sort of low-key way in which she explores relationships in a very human and realistic and empathetic way.
Oh, I love that. I have My Name is Lucy Barton sat on my bookshelf and I haven't got to it yet. So this has just given me the nudge to start that very soon. So thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you go on reading her, because
Oh,
that's
of course.
just the beginning.
Yes. I want to start, before we get into your book, by congratulating you, of course, on being longlisted for this year's Women's Prize for Fiction, which is such a wonderful achievement. How was that experience for you?
Oh, well, it was very exciting and unexpected, I have to say. I mean, I knew my publisher had submitted the book for the prize. It was exciting. Obviously, it's lovely to receive that kind of acknowledgement.
Hmm.
But it was also really good to be in such interesting company.
Yes.
There were several authors I didn't know at all. A few I had read before. And that was a real sense of excitement. And as I say, being in such good company and thinking, well, this means that I will be read alongside these other very interesting and diverse authors.
Yes, it's incredible. And I mean, you well and truly deserved a place on that long list. As I said before, like, this is such an incredible book and I absolutely adored it. So let's get into Somewhere Else. As I said, it's a hugely ambitious book, and at the center we have Rosa Roshkin, and you cover 100 years in this woman's life. You know, we see the family she builds, their careers, their children, their relationships, and there's so much in terms of global politics that you also explore. Going into writing this book, did you kind of know how much ground you'd end up covering?
Well, I knew from the start that Rosa was going to live for 100 years. So yes, in a way, I knew I'd set myself a very large canvas, shall we say. But it was only really in the course of writing that I began to think in terms of, well, an awful lot happened in that 100 years. I can't write a world history. So what am I going to include and what am I going to leave out? And
Yeah.
what are the things that would have impinged most on her life and the life of the people she was close to?
Yeah, and the thing that I found really interesting about this book, because you explore so much, as I said, you explore global politics, but you explore, you know, how there's been so much divide in so many different ways. You explore the world wars, you explore the creation of Israel and how far back the history of Israel and Palestine has gone. You explore all those kind of things, and we see the division between people, but you explore this story through the lens of two neighbouring families, and I really loved that. Could you tell us where that choice came from?
Well, it really came at the very beginning when the novel started to take shape. As I think I say in my note at the end of the book, Morningside Park, where these two families live next door to each other, was where my mother grew up. And I just had it in my mind that I wanted to use that location. And in fact, my first sort of working title for the book was Morningside Park.
Oh, wow.
It was going to be very much about two families and how they connected. And then I kind of worked back from that in a way.
Mm.
So yes, I mean the idea of the two families and the intertwining of their lives was a starting point.
Yeah, I loved that though, and it kind of made me quite sad that I feel like in modern day we've lost that sort of relationship with our neighbours. It's not the same as it once was. I know that when my nana was younger, you know, the neighbours all knew each other, everyone on the street knew each other, whereas I don't think people are, you know, they're not talking to their neighbours as much anymore. You know, I maybe speak to the people on either side occasionally, but there's not that kind of relationship that's built anymore, and I just think that's such a loss.
I agree, although you just wait. When you retire, you will find that you will get to know your neighbors so much better because you're going to be at home much more.
Oh, okay.
That's been my experience.
Oh,
And
okay. Well, that's reassuring then. That's reassuring that there will be that relationship one day. Maybe I need to do what my nana does, which is just offer to bake for everyone on the street.
oh well, that's a great idea. If you're keen on baking.
Yeah, I must do that. I want to ask, because you also wrote in your acknowledgements that you drew on your own family history for your characters. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mentioned the fact that my mother grew up in Morningside Park,
Yeah.
so that was part of it. Rosa's experience is not something that any member of my family shared, but my grandfather came from what was then Vilna, is now Vilnius, and my grandmother's family came from Riga. So that part of family history was just something that I grew up with, and I felt a connection to. Although, as they said, none of the characters in my novel are modeled on real life people in my own family. But my own family's history obviously influenced, but well, certainly influenced my interest in that whole area of experience and influenced some of my characterization as well.
I mean, you've created the most wonderful cast of characters. I loved getting to know them all, and I was actually curious how you kept track of them all and how their lives and relationships changed. Did you have to kind of keep a map on a family tree on the wall?
Well, I didn't have it on the wall, but I did have lots of notes and timelines
Yes.
because I found one of the difficult things sort of keeping track of how old the various characters were in the different generations.
Yeah.
So yes, I had to be, and in fact, one of the things I asked my editor to do was just check that I hadn't made some silly mistake and made somebody older than they could possibly have been, or younger, or just it's very easy to lose track of that kind of thing.
I can imagine. I mean, it's 100 years in somebody's life. I think if there had been an error in there somewhere, nobody would have blamed you for that because, like I said before, you've covered so much ground. But I want to ask you as well about, this is another mention in your acknowledgements about Dr. Rosalie Paul, who I believe influenced the story of Rosa's career in the book. Could you tell us about her and how that might have inspired the clinic, which I think was run by Rosa and her father Max?
Yes, Dr. Paul was my GP.
Oh, wow.
This is quite a long way back, and she was very helpful to me at the tricky time of my life.
Hmm.
But I was fascinated by when I learned a little bit about her own history. I mean, she was a pioneer in women's health and support, and it was really my encounter with her
Hmm.
uh, that gave me this idea that maybe this was something Rosa could be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really important subject to be explored. So I'm grateful that you wrote about that because I didn't really know much about the history of women's health. I only kind of know what's happened, in recent years. So it was really interesting to read about something in that period of time and to see how much has changed and maybe in, parts of the world how things haven't changed.
I think
Let's talk about setting because we explore so much of the globe in this book. It really is an ambitious book. But the main setting, as you said before, was Morningside Park, which is in Edinburgh, I believe. Is that right? Yeah.
yeah.
Why here and what is so special to you about Scotland?
Well, my parents both grew up in Edinburgh, and although I was born in the United States and spent the first half of my childhood there, my parents always talked to Scotland as home, and that's how I grew up thinking of Scotland as home.
Hmm.
Scotland was where we were going to end up. Well, in fact, as a family, we didn't end up in Scotland, but I did. And it made a very we came back to Scotland for holidays, and when I met my Scottish relatives, my grandmother, the only grandparent I knew was my grandmother, various aunts and uncles and cousins. My mother came from a farming background, and some of that comes into the novel as well. So I've known Edinburgh. My first acquaintance with Edinburgh was when I was 4 years old. So I've known Edinburgh for a very long time.
Hmm.
And it was very much, especially my father's city, I think, very, very much a part of his growing up. And it was, in some ways, Edinburgh was my introduction to Scottish history as well, exploring the city as a small child. And there were trams in those days. My brother and I used to get on trams on our own,
Wow.
go to the end of the line, and then just wander around for a bit and get back on the tram and come home.
Oh, I love that. I haven't actually been to Edinburgh yet, and I'm so desperate to go. It just sounds so wonderful, and it's such an artistic city as well. So, as an actor, I think every year I must go to the Edinburgh Fringe, but I just never get the chance to go.
That,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So it was nice to read about it and get to be there somehow. So I want to ask you on a slightly darker note, the book opens with a tragedy, and this isn't a spoiler. I like to keep things spoiler free, but this isn't a spoiler to say as it's on the blurb of the book. But at 5 years old, Rosa's family are murdered in a pogrom. Is that how you say the word? Why this scene as your starting point? What inspired it?
Oh, I can't actually tell you how or when that came into my head as an opening for the novel, but it was certainly from a very early stage. I knew
You
that
knew.
was how I wanted to begin. But as I say, I'm really not sure how or why.
Well, it's an incredibly powerful opening, and one thing, I wanted to say was how well you write tragedy because, as I said before, we see these characters through two world wars. We see the displacement of people being treated in these really inhumane ways. And as you would see in 100 Years of a Life, we see lots of death. But the way you write tragedy, I think, is all the more powerful because you guide us as the reader in one direction and then you pull the rug from under us and, suddenly something's happened and it's really breathtaking the way that you do it. How do you write tragedy effectively?
I suppose I begin with the feeling that tragedy is not something you prepare for. You can't, in most cases,
Mhm.
don't know that it's coming. You may have a sense that things are dangerous in early 20th century Poland and the Russian Empire generally, Jewish communities were anxious.
Yeah.
They knew bad things were happening, and
Yeah.
they knew that bad things could happen to them. But even in that situation, even when you think you're prepared, it's like losing a member of your family. You know that your parents are going to die,
Yeah.
but when it comes, it's a terrible shock.
It is. Yeah.
And so I think the idea that these tragic things just happen almost out of nowhere, and you don't know how you are going to respond, or people around you are going to respond. And it's often, I was going to say low key, but that's not quite the right word. But it's often only afterwards that you realize how terrible something has been.
Mm.
Even through the experience.
Yeah.
I suppose it's something of that, and especially that opening scene where Rosa she's a very young child. She's 5 years old, and when you're that young, you don't really know what is happening. You may have been told by your parents, "Don't do this or do that," or "If this happens, get under the bed."
Yeah.
What Rosa is told.
Yeah.
But it's not real in a way. And I wanted to convey the sense of the unreality of a 5-year-old child experiencing something unimaginably grim
Yeah.
and completely having no control over what happens to her. That's the other thing that I wanted to convey, the sense that you're 5 years old. You don't say, "I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to go there." It's somebody else who's doing it, who's making those decisions. So she's packed off to her aunt and uncle. She's packed off to England. She's handed over to these two people from Edinburgh who want to adopt a child. She has no say in it.
No.
It's all happening to her.
I think it's so kind of interesting the way humans deal with tragedy and the kind of shock that comes with that, and how often we're just kind of going through the motions. We have to keep going because we have to continue with life. And I think the way that you explore these characters, and something horrendous will happen and they just have to continue doing these very mundane tasks because such is life. But I think that was probably one of the most upsetting things, is that we do just have to carry on when somebody dies or when something awful happens. And I just found this book so incredibly moving.
Well, I'm glad you found it moving. Obviously, when you're writing about things like that, you want people to be affected. I mean,
Of
that's why you write.
course. Yeah.
That's why you put words down on the page. But having said that, and of course, I am writing about experiences most of us probably won't have,
Yes.
millions, but we all have our terrible moments to deal with.
Yeah.
And as you say, by and large, people carry on. Life
Yeah,
goes on.
it does. Were there any parts of the book that you found quite difficult to write?
There were parts of the book that were quite challenging to write,
Hmm.
because when you're writing in a historical context, you're always having to make decisions about how much to include.
Mm.
So if I'm writing about the Second World War, I can't include a whole history or background to the Second World War. I have to assume that there are certain things that people will know,
Mm.
and make a decision on what sort of tiny, tiny fragment of the whole experience of 6 years to actually try and express on the page. And I do find sometimes when I'm reading historical fiction that there's a kind of information overload going on, too
Yeah.
much detail, and you get the feeling that the writer knows an awful lot about this and is determined to get everything down.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily make for a narrative that works.
I haven't always got on very, and it frustrates. My best friend is an author and writes historical fiction, and I absolutely love her work, but I have always struggled with historical fiction for that very reason that you just said. I find it quite overwhelming, and sometimes it can be quite dense. And I sometimes feel a bit stupid, like I can't quite grasp it. But I just found that with this book, I was so completely drawn in and immersed in this world, and it didn't feel so far away. It didn't feel far away from me, if that makes sense. It often feels like with historical fiction, I feel so far removed from it that I can't imagine myself in those spaces and with these people. But with this, I felt like I was in those places with them, and it just felt like an incredibly accessible book in that sense. I don't know if I've articulated that very well, but I do think the way that you've written about history is so compelling. And I'm really glad that you wrote this.
Well, I do tend to feel that in many cases, less is more.
Mm,
And that, I mean, to go back to what you were asking about how I wrote about the tragic
yes.
events,
Yeah.
I think I tend to lean towards that less is more.
Yeah.
That you can often convey more with fewer words.
Yes, for sure. Part of your story takes place in Palestine, and we see the creation of Israel, which those parts of the book felt particularly poignant when, there is so much devastation throughout your book of what has happened throughout history in many different places. But what we're still seeing today continues to play out in Gaza. Why was it important to you to explore the history of Palestine and Israel in your book?
Well, I went to Israel when I was just 18 years old
Hmm.
and just found it. I was so impressed by the whole feel of this very new nation. And I just had an extraordinary experience there in many ways, some of which I've drawn on,
Yeah.
obviously, when I've described Esther's experiences, although I have to say mine were quite different. And it's a part of my heritage, and it's Israel, the story of how Israel happened, which
Hmm.
I have to say I get sometimes annoyed today. So many people who have an opinion on what is happening now, which is appalling beyond words,
Yeah.
but that opinion has often seems to be completely without any knowledge or understanding of how it all got there.
Mm.
How and why did Israel come to exist in the first place? But that's another whole issue.
Yeah,
But I
I think you're right though. I don't think people realize the extent of this history between these two places. I don't think people realize like just how long this has been going on for. It was really interesting to read about it because I'm certainly, I'm not knowledgeable on this topic. I know that the issues there have gone on long before October 7th.
it's very difficult to get to grips with, and it's very difficult. Hindsight, as everyone says, is a wonderful thing. I mean, you
Hmm.
could see the seeds planted decades ago of
Hmm.
what is happening now, but at the time, half a century ago, there actually were people who said there are going to be problems, and there are going to be things which are possibly never going to be solved. However, I don't know, would people half a century ago have really predicted that things would just be as awful as they are now?
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's a moment in the book that I want to reference where there's a man called Avram, I think he's called, who had been at Auschwitz, and he says, "Have we learnt nothing?" And there's another moment much later in the book when Bruce says to Edie, when they're discussing Thatcher's politics, "We need to have faith in the younger generation." And I want to ask, do you have faith in the younger generation in learning from the past and creating positive change?
I think you must have faith in the younger generation. That's
What would
why
be the
there is a
point?
younger generation.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's absolutely vital to believe that things can get better.
Yeah.
Because what's the alternative? I and friends of my generation often find ourselves saying to each other, would we at the age of I have a grandson who is in a few days' time is going to be 20.
Oh,
Would we as 20-year-olds have thought that the world would be where it is now?
yeah.
Not for a million years. I don't think we
No.
would devise some kind of scenario that could have any relation to where the world is now, both in terms of conflict and the state of the planet and all of that. I don't think we could have projected a narrative that would have included all that and all these things that are happening at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I've said, you've covered so much ground, and I think, you could have continued to write those family stories, and I think it could just continue forever. And I would love to have followed these characters forever. And I know that your main sort of protagonist was Rosa, but I really want to ask you if outside of Rosa, if there was a particular character that you really enjoyed immersing yourself in their mind and why that might be.
Well, I think I actually enjoy writing all my characters.
You can't choose a favorite child.
I was asked a similar question. I think at the was it possibly at the launch of the book, and my answer then was, well, I'm very fond of Yossi.
Yes.
Rosa's grandson, whose life, I think I was perhaps a bit unfair to Yossi because I feel his life didn't quite develop as he might have wished, but I think he's a good person.
He really is.
So yeah, it's, you're not allowed to have favorites amongst your own children, and you're not allowed to have favorites amongst the characters you create either.
Well, Yossi is an incredible character, and I loved reading about him. I loved all of these characters, and I really felt like I knew them by the end, and I didn't want to let them go. Before I let you go, what do you hope readers will take away from your book?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I hope that they will perhaps understand better the experiences of displacement.
Mm-hmm.
The experiences of learning to make your life in a place and amongst people in which at the beginning you have very little connection.
Yeah.
I think that's why I wrote it.
And you did such a beautiful job. So, as I said before, listeners, Somewhere Else is out now, and I'll be popping a link in the show notes to buy yourselves a copy. It's really important that you do, because I just want everybody to read this book. I adored it and think so highly of you, Jenni, and I'm so grateful that you put this family story onto the page for me to read. Are there any books that you would like to recommend?
Well, I mentioned Elizabeth Strout. I would recommend all her books. I'd also recommend that you start at the beginning. So you start with her first book, because she writes about the same characters. They keep coming up in subsequent books. I have to say that most of my favorite contemporary authors are women and American. So, for example, I've just recently read a novel by Joyce Carol Oates, whom I admire greatly. I mean, she's an extraordinary writer. So simultaneously sort of sharp and unforgiving, but empathetic. And she writes about so many different situations and different kinds of people, and she's very impressive. But there's at least half a dozen other American women writers writing now whom I admire greatly.
I think there's some wonderful recommendations. I did also spot on the Women's Prize website that you'd recommended Barbara Kingsolver, who I must get to and still haven't. So
yes, she's another one. She's in my top 10 favorites.
Oh, wow. Okay. I must get her on my list this summer when I have a break from podcast reading. Demon Copperhead is on my shelf, so I will be getting to that.
It's brilliant. It really is.
Oh, good. I mean, as I said, listeners, before, Somewhere Else is out now. Grab yourselves a copy. And lastly, thank you so much, Jenni, for joining me today. I've loved chatting to you, and I loved your book.
Oh, well, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. That is all we've got time for. Jenni, can the listeners find you online, or are you not online?
I'm not online.
Good for you.
I don't do online.
A wise choice. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.